So we're going to talk about something slightly sadder now. Don't start crying just yet, but it is of course one of those downers. Now the rise of online video streaming services is diminishing movie audiences. Now Ster-Kinekor recently announced that it was undergoing a restructuring process, including the gradual closure of some of the movie theatres around the country, as well as job cuts.
There's a specific kind of Saturday morning that doesn't exist anymore. The kind where the day felt like it had real weight to it, like something was actually going to happen. My mother worked at Standard Bank in Benoni, and while she was at the branch doing her job, I'd head to Lakeside Mall alone. Not with her, alone. The way kids used to be allowed to exist in public spaces without anyone panicking about it. I'd have money for the arcade, money for something to eat, and if the timing worked out, money for a movie. That was the deal. And Ster-Kinekor was always the anchor of it. She'd worked at Ster-Kinekor herself in the 1990s, we've still got the photos. Her in uniform, standing in a cinema lobby with the kind of confidence that tells you she genuinely enjoyed being there. It wasn't a job she tolerated, she liked it. She moved on eventually, took the banking career more seriously, built something more stable. But she never stopped caring about the cinema as a place, and she made sure I understood what it was supposed to feel like. In May 2003, we went to see X-Men United. In May 2004, Shrek 2. I remember both of those trips not because the films were life-changing, though they were pretty great, but because the experience had a texture to it. The lobby noise, the smell of popcorn that you could pick up from halfway down the mall corridor, the way you stood in the ticket queue and looked up at the board deciding between two options as if it were a serious decision. It was an event. You didn't just watch a movie. You went to the movies. That version of Ster-Kinekor is gone. And it didn't go quietly. By May 2025, Ster-Kinekor had closed 3 of its most prominent locations: Cavendish Square in Cape Town, Bedford Square in Bedfordview, one of the largest retail complexes in the entire country. These weren't marginal sites in struggling areas. These were flagship locations in high-income, high-traffic zones. And they closed fast, with very little warning, leaving malls with dark, empty cinema foyers where there used to be lines. This isn't a story about load shedding. It isn't a story about a few bad years during COVID. It's a story about a business model that was already structurally failing before any of those things happened, and about what occurs when distressed asset investors buy what's left of it and start making decisions based purely on numbers.
Ster-Kinekor's business rescue practitioner has announced that the business rescue plan for the cinema company has been approved by creditors and shareholders. Just take us back in time and explain why Ster-Kinekor was placed in business rescue in the first place.
In particular, it was heavily hit through the COVID period, suffering from a hard lockdown in the first period of 2020.
Business rescue is a legal process in South Africa that gives a financially struggling company temporary protection from its creditors while it tries to restructure. It's not liquidation. It's not bankruptcy in the American sense. It's more like a supervised timeout. The company keeps operating while a practitioner works out whether it can be saved and how. In late 2022, Ster-Kinekor exited that process after being acquired for R250 Million by 2 firms, Blantyre Capital, a UK-based distressed debt investor, and Greenpoint Capital, operating out of South Africa. The key word in that sentence is distressed. These aren't entertainment companies. They're not film lovers or industry veterans with a vision for the future of cinema. They're financial firms that specialize in buying assets that are already in trouble, restructuring them to reduce losses, and eventually selling whatever survives at a profit. That's not a criticism, it's just the job description. And it matters enormously for understanding every decision they've made since. When a distressed asset firm buys a business, the first question they ask isn't, how do we grow this? It's, what's actually viable here, and what do we need to cut to get to it? The entire frame shifts from expansion to triage. So when people look at the closures and the job cuts and the general retreat of Ster-Kinekor over the past 3 years and ask what went wrong, they're partly asking the wrong question. The new owners didn't cause the structural problems. They inherited them. What they're doing now is trying to cut fast enough to reach something sustainable before the whole thing becomes unsellable. To understand the structural rot, you need to understand 2 things that don't get talked about enough in the general coverage: the collapse of the theatrical window, and what you might call the rental trap. The theatrical window is the amount of time a film plays exclusively in cinemas before it becomes available on streaming platforms or for home purchase. In the old model, the model that built Ster-Kinekor's dominance, that window was around 6 months. A major film would open in cinemas, and for roughly half a year, if you wanted to see it, the cinema was the only legal option. That window was the entire economic justification for the cinema's existence. It was in scarcity. That window has collapsed. The average theatrical window today is around 45 days. Some studios push it to 60. Very few hold it anywhere near what it used to be. That means a film that opens in cinemas on a Friday is available to stream at home by the time you've had 2 full weekends with it. For anyone who's even slightly price sensitive, and in South Africa's current economic environment, that's most people, the calculation becomes very simple. Wait 6 weeks, watch it at home, pay nothing or close to nothing. The studios made this decision for their own reasons, primarily because streaming platforms give them direct access to subscriber data and recurring revenue that doesn't depend on cinema operators taking a cut. The cinemas didn't get a vote. The window just shrank, and the economic case for showing up on opening weekend dramatically. Then there's the rental trap. Ster-Kinekor's model was built around premium mall locations. Sandton City, Eastgate, Gateway, Cavendish Square, these are expensive places to operate. The lease costs in high-end South African malls are substantial. They tend to escalate over time, and they're locked in contractually for years. When the model was working, when cinemas were pulling consistent crowds and selling significant volumes of food and drink, those leases made sense. The foot traffic justified the rent. As audiences shrank, that calculation flipped. You're now paying premium rent for a location that's attracting a fraction of its former audience, selling less food and drink, and competing against platforms that have no physical overhead at all. Netflix doesn't pay rent. Showmax doesn't need parking. The cinema is stuck with a cost structure designed for a much busier version of itself, and there's no easy way out of it mid-lease. This is why the closures are happening where they are. The locations being cut aren't in dying malls. They're in the most expensive malls, where the gap between what the site costs to run and what it's actually earning has become impossible to close. In April 2024, Ster-Kinekor initiated a Section 189 consultation process, the formal procedure under South African labor law that a company must follow before implementing large-scale retrenchments. The process put 236 jobs at risk and flagged 9 cinema locations as potential closures. The final outcome of that round saw approximately 60 head office positions cut and 2 cinemas closed, Boardwalk in Richards Bay and Greenstone. Those 2 closures were already a significant signal. Greenstone serves a large, populated area with genuine disposable income in the East Rand. It wasn't a struggling location in a failing suburb. It was a real commercial site that simply couldn't sustain the economics of cinema anymore at that specific rent, with that specific audience size. The closure of Cavendish Square, Bedford Square, and Gateway in May 2025 was categorically different from what came before. These are Tier 1 sites by any commercial definition, locations that, for most of Ster-Kinekor's operational history, would have been considered untouchable. The crown jewels, the ones you protect last. Closing them isn't a pivot. It's an acknowledgement that the business that justified those leases no longer exists in sufficient form. And the aftermath of those closures carries its own particular irony. New Metro, Ster-Kinekor's main competitor, moved almost immediately to take over the Gateway and Bedford Square sites. The cinema infrastructure didn't disappear. A competitor judged that they could make the economics work better than Ster-Kinekor could. Whether they are right will take a few years to determine, but the message is clear. The problem was specific to how Ster-Kinekor was running those locations, not to the locations themselves. Ster-Kinekor has publicly discussed diversification. E-gaming events, alternative programming, using their venues for experiences beyond standard film screenings. It sounds reasonable on the surface. If the core cinema product isn't drawing enough people consistently, bring in other reasons to visit the space. The problem is that this strategy raises a fundamental question about what the business actually is. A cinema company's core competency is curating and screening film content in a purpose-built environment. The physical space, the sound system, the seating layout, the screen size, all of it is designed around one specific use case. When you start trying to run gaming tournaments and corporate events and alternative programming in that same space, you're essentially asking a venue built for one thing to compete in markets it wasn't designed for. E-gaming venues already exist. They're built differently, they're marketed differently, and they attract a different demographic with different habits and expectations. Ster-Kinekor's advantage in that space isn't obvious. Their brand is associated with movies. Their infrastructure is optimized for movies. Their staff are trained around movies. The idea that pivoting to e-gaming represents a meaningful long-term revenue stream for a national cinema chain isn't well supported by the available evidence. The concession stand argument is similarly shaky. Ster-Kinekor does make meaningful revenue from food and drink sales. Popcorn margins are genuinely significant in cinema economics. But the concession stand only generates revenue when there are people in the building. It's not a standalone business. It depends entirely on the cinema product attracting a crowd large enough to sell to. Calling it a strategic pivot misunderstands the relationship between the two revenue streams. One enables the other. They don't substitute for each other. I bought my first DVD sometime in the mid-2000s. It was a Jean-Claude Van Damme 6-in-1 collection, 6 full films on a couple of discs for less than the price of 2 cinema tickets. That purchase made a kind of financial sense that was very hard to argue against. Then came Madagascar 1 and 2. Then Garfield. A shelf started filling up, and somewhere in the process, the trip to Lakeside Mall for a single film started feeling less essential. That shift wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a decision I made consciously. It was just a slow accumulation of convenience outweighing occasion. The cinema was an event when it was the only option. Once there was a cheaper, easier option that worked almost as well, the event stopped feeling necessary. The streaming era made that shift permanent and removed the cost barrier entirely. Today, the same content that plays in a cinema is available at home within 6 weeks, often for a fraction of the price, sometimes for free. The quality gap that once made the cinema screen genuinely superior has narrowed significantly as home display technology has improved. And in a country where electricity costs are rising, where disposable income is under sustained pressure, and where the real cost of a cinema outing for a family, tickets, parking, snacks easily exceeds our 500, the calculation almost never favors the cinema. This is not unique to South Africa. Cinema attendance has declined globally since the early 2010s, with the pandemic accelerating a trend that was already well established. The industry has been aware of the problem for years. The solutions proposed have mostly not worked. Ster-Kinekor still holds between 55% and 60% of the South African cinema market. That sounds like a strong position, and in relative terms it is. They're still the dominant operator in a country where New Metro and a handful of independent chains make up the rest. But market share is only meaningful relative to the size of the market itself, and the South African cinema market is shrinking. Holding 55% of something that's getting smaller every year isn't a recovery strategy. It's a slower version of the same problem. The business that emerges from this restructuring, if it survives in coherent form, will be significantly smaller than what Ster-Kinekor was at its peak. Fewer locations, concentrated in the sites that can demonstrably sustain themselves, with a cost structure that's been cut back to match a reduced audience. That might be viable. A leaner, more focused operation with lower overhead and a clearer sense of which customers it's actually serving could theoretically find a floor and stabilize there. Whether that floor is high enough to justify the R250 Million purchase price and eventually deliver a return to Blantyre and Greenpoint Capital is the financial question that will determine this company's future. The private equity firms have a timeline. They're not holding this asset indefinitely out of affection for the cinema experience. At some point they'll want an exit, and the business needs to be sellable by then. My mother looked genuinely happy in those old photos, standing in a cinema lobby in the 1990s, in her uniform, in a building full of people who'd made a deliberate choice to be there. That version of the industry, where the cinema was an automatic destination, where the trip itself had value beyond the film, supported a very different kind of business than what exists now. What's left is a company trying to find out how small it needs to get before it can survive. And survival, at this stage, is the only realistic goal on the table.